As we consider the political protests that are breaking out in many parts of the world, we have to ask ourselves, are these genuine revolutions or are they simply technology-driven fads? We'll look at those issues next.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
Hello and welcome to the Global Perspectives Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at the University of Central Florida. Our guest today is Dr. Georges Fauriol, who's the Vice President of the National Endowment for Democracy. Welcome, Dr. Fauriol.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, we are seeing all kinds of democratic processes or semi-democratic processes unfolding all over the world. Some are happening very, very close to us here in Florida. Some are happening far away. One of your areas of interest for many years has been Haiti. So talk to us a bit about what's happening in Haiti and what the prospects are there.
Well, Haiti is always in the news, is always an area of interest in the media, in the academic world, in sort of democracy observers, if you will. I think there are maybe four factors first to look at in terms of what's happening in Haiti. One, obviously, is that the political process seems to stumble from time to time, almost on an almost predictable basis. Elections, and then there's a political crisis, and another election, and sometimes there's, unfortunately, also a series of humanitarian crises which trigger additional international intervention. So in some ways, moving forward, a new government in Haiti will have to almost automatically, regardless of when it occurs and who it is, address four issues. One of them is, in effect, the reconstruction process following the earthquake, following in previous years also a number of hurricanes and natural disasters. And this is a major issue in terms of the reconstruction of a capital city almost from scratch.
And what are we talking about in terms of time frame here, realistically, for this?
To have a real physical, visible, viewable impact, we're talking about 3 or 4 years. In terms of actually completing a project like that, it's almost partially a generational issue. We're talking about 15 years, 10, 15 years.
Okay.
Particularly because we're starting from scratch almost. Keep in mind that the infrastructure was never very good in the first place, but was destroyed, including both the public infrastructure in terms of the government, as well as average sort of businesses and individual homes, highways, electricity, everything was basically destroyed.
And then the second item?
Second item really is the sequencing of political crises. Haiti somehow has to overcome this process because, in effect, each election seems to be preceded by a political crisis and then followed by another political crisis. So something is wrong. And it's either an issue involving the procedures, which may be a little narrow, or it involves in some ways having the Haitian people, in fact, come together into some sort of a political consensus, which really hasn't occurred in the last 20 years following the fall of the Duvalier government. So
is there any issue that might drive that kind of consensus, or is there a group or a viable institution within Haitian society that might take a leadership role on developing such a consensus?
Arguably, at a very high level of generality, I would look at two constituencies, very familiar to any audience. One is youth. Youth is ultimately the constituency that understands technology, that in some ways begins to understand what the real world looks like, is willing to communicate and organize, and now actually has the cell phones and other kind of machines, if you will, to deal with that. It can organize in some ways independently of other constituencies or even the government for that matter, to pressure authorities to kind of maybe do a different thing, something new, something different. The other constituency is in some ways a women who are often underestimated in the Haitian context in political terms, but play an important role in economic terms. And in recent years, we've seen female personalities, if you will, rise a little bit through the political process. And I think that's another constituency that ultimately could play an important role in galvanizing a different approach, if you will, to politics. To put it maybe a bit simplistically, Haitian political leadership hasn't done all that well, and much of it has been male. So I'm not trying to simplify things a little bit, but it's an important issue which I think one should look at in terms of the future of the country.
And at the same time, we've seen many reports, especially since the earthquake, about how women have been disproportionately affected and often abused.
Correct.
In shocking numbers.
That's right.
And I'm wondering how you reconcile, the need for the relative rise of women in terms of leadership with this ongoing and seemingly expanding anti-woman.
In some ways, women,
activity.
I think, are in response to both the incidents of violence as well as the destruction of their homes, of their communities, are the ones who also in some ways are organizing or are mobilized. And this is where in some ways the international community does help, including the democracy community, which does play an important role in some cases in channeling a lot of this energy into networks, including international women's networks, which ultimately provides an additional component where a Haitian women's group, a Haitian community leadership, which involves women, can ultimately learn lessons from other experiences elsewhere in the world.
I've interrupted you and kept you from your list. I think you were on
the second
item
one.
3.
Let me run to item 3. Item 3 in some ways is perhaps somewhat unique to Haiti, which is that any government that ultimately is in office, at least for now and in foreseeable future, will have to deal with in some ways the experiences of some of its immediate predecessors. And there are unresolved political issues, sort of a national discussion about the role of, in one case, baby dog Jean-Claude Duvalier, as well as in another case, Jean Bertrand Aristide. And in some ways we can look at those individuals as part of a national dialogue which has not occurred. And here the issue is not so much whether they should be in a court of law, although that's obviously an important political and legal question, but rather whether the country can again come together, a little bit like in the South African experience following apartheid, whether they can actually develop a national dialogue where explanations for past actions are come out in the open. It's not that you absolve people of past mistakes and sins, but at least you have a beginning of a natural consensus that can develop. And part of that ultimately will have to account for these two individuals and their associates, which frankly is a dialogue which hasn't occurred.
And then the fourth item.
The fourth one is in some ways goes back to the earthquake, is that Haiti, because of where it is, and it's been very unlucky in the last several years. But in a sequence over a number of years, it's the earthquake, it's hurricanes, it's rainy storms, it's an environment which has deteriorated dramatically. This is a country where you travel, and if you are not an environmentalist and you have no interest in the issue, you go to Haiti and you come back and you're a full-fledged 100% environmentalist because of the clear natural degradation of the environment. Topsoil is eroding into the ocean. The production of the country, agricultural production, is therefore in the same time moving out into the ocean. This has become a serious issue. It's also a health problem in a way. The earthquake and those natural disasters have further weakened an already weak social, medical, health infrastructure. And therefore a future government of Haiti, whatever that government is, ultimately that will be a major issue. Again, this is a component that the international community can also play an important role, although it should play an important role also in strengthening and building Haitian institutions. You could almost add a fifth factor here in the analysis of Haiti, which is the debate that exists between the international community and the Haitian government in general, which over time, in effect, one has attempted to bypass the other, which is the imperfections of the Haitian government have led the international community, the private international community through non-governmental organizations, private voluntary organizations, to put a lot of their efforts in building institutional mechanisms that avoid having to do business, if you will, with the government. There are understandable reasons for that, very practical, political, financial management, corruption. But over the long term, it simply further weakens the very governmental institutions which ultimately will move Haiti forward towards being more prosperous, its people and government be more accountable, and thirdly, be more democratic.
I know we could talk about this for quite a while, but your responsibilities at the National Endowment for Democracy extend well beyond Haiti and even the Caribbean. And because of all of the political unrest that has been taking place in North Africa and the Middle East in recent months, I think that would be a great topic for you to address for a few minutes. What is your overall sense of what is happening in that region?
Well, these are exciting times, but obviously only the future will tell us exactly in which direction one ultimately this is going, what direction this is going to take. But there are a couple generalizations that one can draw already, which I think will develop further into the future. One of them clearly is what recently, the last several months, and probably will continue in the next several months and next years, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, in Yemen, in Bahrain, all of those explosions, if you will, of citizens going out in the streets and basically complaining against autocratic governments and demanding a different arrangement, if you will, social, economic, and political arrangement. What is exciting about those events is that they're homegrown. These are not events that are concocted somewhere in the basement of some bureaucracy over in some foreign government ministry. This is homegrown, and in fact, it came as a surprise, confirms that these are homegrown. It also confirms that the true quality of these developments is actually most revealing. These are people taking matters into their own hands and responding to years of abuse. That's the exciting part. Obviously, the difficult part is both for them to try to turn that around and pursue that towards a better future. It also confirms that democracy, in the end, is not an exportable item. You can promote it, you can support it. Certainly the United States does that, and I think it does that quite well. Speaking for myself, the organization that I represent works around the world with small groups, private citizens, if you will. But in the end, the hard work, the commitment has to be done by the citizens of their own country. So this is an interesting indication, again, that real democracy ultimately can only develop when the people on the ground, the citizens of that country, take matters into their own hands. Another generalization is the role of technology, information technology. Clearly, this was evident in previous episodes in Iran, in Burma back some years ago. But in this case, we also see, in effect, social media playing an important role in how people organize themselves, how activists are able to talk to each other, develop the message, in some ways overcome or go around government restrictions. And this is an important component. It's likely to grow further, although governments themselves might actually be able to react and use some of the same tools. So this is not just a one-way game.
I want to come back to that a little bit later, but explain to us, the U.S. government for the better part of the past decade had an active interest in not just promoting democracy, but helping with nation building and so forth. It's always been a goal of this country, but it was an especially activist phase. And yet, a lot of, as you were saying, a lot of the movement that we've seen in recent months wasn't really connected with that. It was homegrown. Are they connected in some way?
They are connected in some ways, in the sense that the ability, the interest, even to some degree the tools that they used were in part learned from other experiences. There are some indication, for example, that some of the Egyptian activists had some knowledge of what had happened in Serbia and the Balkans in the 1990s. You don't want to overdo that connection, but it's clearly there, and you hear some of it from the Egyptians themselves.
And I saw a documentary that interviewed some of the individuals in Serbia who were talking about how they were and had been training people to go out in the streets and protest in North Africa. And I didn't know to what extent that was happening, but it was an interesting dimension.
It's an interesting dimension. It highlighted the nonviolent aspect of that. It also highlighted a little bit the Serbian experience among students, which basically student movement. It also sort of outlined to the Egyptians and others a little bit the sequencing of events, which is you always want to try to stay ahead of what the government may or may not do. It highlighted the issue of the message, always be positive, always be positive. So there are lessons learned, and those events, while they're homegrown, didn't operate in a vacuum. So they're not totally unconnected to what happened in a more forceful and certainly violent way in Iraq and elsewhere in the region in the previous decade.
Let's go back to the technology revolution. I think it's been fascinating to watch how new and evolving technologies have played a role, and social media in particular. Why is it that the governments in this region seem to be almost baffled by the technology?
Well, part of it, I think, goes back to the autocratic nature of those regimes. A willingness and ability, but at the same time, a belief that everything can be centralized into a bureaucracy, that the police, the intelligence service, the military in some cases, have an overall control, both in terms of what they do as well as the fear factor which they instill into the population. What many of them haven't fully appreciated, although that may change, the Iranians have, the government has learned a little bit of those lessons, is that they can use the same tools in trying to counteract the message. But it's difficult, because in most cases citizens understand what the message of the government is. The fact that they can now see it in a small message doesn't convince them that it's any better. But so the governments do have a challenge in that. You see appearances of that in an indirect way, in the sense that in some Arab countries, Morocco, Jordan, where the system is slightly more competitive, a little more open, at least has been in recent years, the government is trying to, in effect, try to stay ahead, if you will, of popular pressures by changing government personalities, by in some ways providing a greater engagement from civil society groups. And social media plays to some degree a role in that, in getting sort of the word out and having sort of a public negotiations, if you will, of issues which are under question. But by and large, autocratic governments don't understand that. Now, some ultimately under duress will understand the role that media plays in general. An autocratic government, we may see that in Libya, we may see that elsewhere in other countries, will invite journalists to come over and see their side of the story. But that's rather old-fashioned in a way. It doesn't really convince anyone, but it does provide a methodology whereby the government appears to be projecting a different image rather than simply collapse. But it doesn't really play in the social media environment, because the social media environment is actually even more mobilized when it sees the government taking that particular traditional route.
Do you anticipate that these new and developing technologies will play an increasingly large role in these kinds of protests and movements as we look at the decades ahead?
I think so, and you see that moving beyond the Middle East. You saw that in Burma some years ago with the revolt of the monks, where for the first time, and to the surprise of the government of Burma, the military government at that time, pictures of people being beaten up were suddenly going around the world almost instantaneously. Clearly the leaders of the government had overlooked the fact that cell phones have cameras in them and they can be transmitted. And they didn't shut down the internet and telephone system quickly enough to be able to control that. Mm-hmm. Go even further, in countries like China or other fairly sophisticated environments, not only economically but socially and certainly technologically, it becomes very difficult for the government to manage every step of the way of a social media process. And one of the interesting debates that affects everyone, frankly, Americans and Chinese and frankly the society of the world in general, is this tension between being able to communicate personally with your other citizens through a social media network and having some response also coming in from the government that attempts to curtail or to limit or to push you in a particular use of a particular service. In the long run, my sense, speaking a little bit from the democracy community, autocratic governments are in the losing end of that particular battle. Even though they may be able to respond technologically with mechanisms that control that message, the creativity of human beings in a free society, particularly with the technology, will always be ahead, if you will, of the autocratic government. I think that's the exciting part, if you will, of the issue of social media and all of its extensions, if you will, in different parts of the world.
I think it's interesting and more than a bit ironic that before the upheaval started in North Africa and the Middle East, you had some observers talking about how peace and security issues, with the exception of cases like Iraq and Afghanistan, were largely a matter of the past, and that 9/11 was an aberration, and they were seemingly looking forward to a period of relative stability and calm. And I don't know what they were thinking, but to me, what we're experiencing now is the biggest example of the peace and security challenge that we've seen since the end of the Cold War.
It is, in part because it comes in a region which has had difficulty, if you will, in terms of political stability, particularly of a democratic variant. It is also a region which is of strategic interest to the United States, frankly the rest of the world, because of its partially its oil resources and gas resources. It's also in some ways the region of the world which has been resistant to modern political development, to be blunt about it. It doesn't mean that the Middle East and societies, citizens of those countries don't want democracy, don't appreciate democracy. In fact, there are international surveys that prove that point. It's just that they've been, in effect, run by regimes that, by and large, are either traditionally autocratic or simply sort of dictatorial in character in the last several decades. There are some that are suggesting that this is the beginning of a new wave of democracy, the fourth wave, to use Samuel Huntington's sort of wave terminology. Perhaps some in my own organization, including president of the National Endowment, is suggesting those kinds of thoughts. Others are trying to develop that idea. I think there's some utility in looking at that. Obviously, it's sort of the big picture, and certainly provides a framework of analysis, and it underscores how important those developments are for not only the United States and everyone that lives in this country, but the rest of the world.
An interesting question that I think is on the mind of a lot of people is that what we're experiencing here is obviously different in every country, and the expectations of the people vary from place to place. But in a general sense, without addressing specific countries, what is enough? Is it enough to have a top leader step down? You hear people talking about regime change, but as far as I can tell, there hasn't been regime change anywhere. There's just been a rotation of leaders, a reshuffling of governments and so forth. But what is enough to satisfy the protesters?
I think in the end, probably two, perhaps three, but certainly two factors. One of them, as you say, it's not just having a new person who happened to be part maybe of the previous government, but is more appealing. That's not going to be much of a transition. I think is an indication that the people that are protesting, the activists and their followers, are actually then able to play a role in whatever follows. And not just being able to put a ballot in a ballot box, actually participate in their own communities, elect their own representatives, whatever the mechanism is, participate in the process. I think that's ultimately, it's broad, it's vague, it's messy, but that's what satisfies people and leads them to again go to work and be with their families and live a normal life. Short of that, there's that tension. The other issue in some ways is that this process is has enough credibility and durability that it actually sustains itself over time. You have transitions, particularly those that occurred after the fall of the Soviet Union. In the outer years of that transition, particularly in the late 1990s and then after the turn of the century, Ukraine may be a good example of that, where there's a lot of enthusiasm. People actually go out in the street. I was there in November and December of 2004 in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine, with the demonstrators in the cycle of demonstrations and elections. Except the government that came out of that was representative of this new wave of thought and ideal, but it didn't deliver. So therefore, the second issue is, like every true democratic government, it has to deliver, not only politically, but it has to deliver economically and socially. And sometimes democracy gets a bad name because it does well on the first round, but doesn't do well on the second issue. But that ultimately, that's what's going to get people to leave the central square and stop demonstrating, is to ensure that there's a process by which ultimately it's not only transparent and fair and credible and they can participate in it, but also they ultimately can survive economically and socially. The two ultimately are required for democracy. You cannot have just one or the other.
Perhaps as a way to wrap up, as you look out at the world broadly speaking, are you optimistic about the future of democracy, whether it's the Caribbean or North Africa and the Middle East? Does the future look bright?
I have to be an optimist in this sort of line of work, and frankly, the optimism is based on the fact that individuals, by and large, want a better life. They also want their own personal freedoms. We also know, generally, and the American experience is a good example of that the combination of those factors also gives you opportunities. And when you put limits on those opportunities is when you run into problems. But by and large, the historical trend over time, over centuries, is towards more freedom, more individual capacity to do what ultimately is good for your family, for your community, and ultimately for mankind. And while there are zigzags in that process and tragedies and disappointments, by and large, the movement keeps moving forward, and that's really the encouraging part. So yes, I'm positive.
Good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Fauriol.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.